Yeah, I really wanted to bring that up because a lot of people will associate the word keto with, what they know from the magazine, magazine rack at the grocery store. It says keto, it's a diet, it's butter and bacon, and that's all fine and good. But I think we underappreciate what the natural normal state, like you said, of ketosis really is, and all the wonderful, amazing things it can do for us. I mean, in your own training, you mentioned Peter Attia, but in your own training in all the universities you went to and learning and all that stuff, was it ever taught to you?
Well, yeah, I came through physiology. So I learned about ketoacidosis, but not ketosis. But we certainly learned more about what happens at metabolism at the cellular molecular level, because I didn't go through like medical school. I went through, life science and biology and biochemistry and that. So yeah, I was familiar with it, but not so much in terms of nutritional ketosis, because I believed for decades, and I taught for decades, a model of healthy nutrition, which was completely unjustified, in fact, wrong, and now we've learned kind of dangerous, which was, you should have a high carbohydrate, low fat diet, and that was the healthiest thing. And I just, that's what we learned. So you just kind of believe that. And it wasn't until much later in my career when I started investigating nutritional science, now going back almost 20 years, and I started looking for the evidence for that. Is there any evidence for it? And there really wasn't. There was really just a hypothesis, by a guy named Ansel Keys, that because we were seeing these increased rates of cardiovascular disease and they could see plaques and so on, those plaques involve cholesterol, that cholesterol was a big problem, and it was cholesterol in our diet that was creating the problem. And so that's where that whole, like from the 60s, that whole idea of getting fat and cholesterol out of your diet came from. But sadly, it was really well adopted, by medical establishments and by health authorities, but also by the general public as the truth. And still, I mean, go and talk to anybody, and you say, "Oh, I'm going to have steak and eggs or whatever," and they'd be worried about your saturated fat and your cholesterol, and those two things are actually pretty normal. And the cholesterol in your diet, unless you have certain genetic predispositions, isn't really going to affect the cholesterol in your blood, because the cholesterol in your blood is produced by your liver. And saturated fat, I don't know, seems like the cleanest burning fuel you can put in your body. It's just carbon and hydrogen. And there is some, we could talk about the length of the chains of those saturated fatty acids, but saturated fats are completely benign, unless you have a high carbohydrate diet, in which case you probably have some triglyceride issues in your blood and you probably shouldn't be eating saturated fat. But it's not the fat that's the problem, it's the carbohydrate, especially that high glycemic index carbohydrate you get, especially from ultra processed foods. So.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. I find it interesting that, you were schooled, got your PhD, learned about biology, but this whole like way of living, a whole system of using energy inside the
Mhm.
body. And again, all the positive effects, like they just like breeze past it and don't really teach you much about it until, you have to learn about this 20 years later and discover that the whole linchpin of what we're told about nutrition is not true, has never been proven. It was a hypothesis. It still is to this day. And it sure didn't really help us with what we thought it was going to help with, which was heart disease. That's still the number one killer today.
Yeah, it is. And I'll just tell you a little story about someone I was just talking to, a friend of mine, won't mention names, but her brother was just undergoing what we call cabbage surgery, so coronary artery bypass graft, cabbage. So bypass surgery, people call it commonly. And I was just asking her how it was going, and he's in his early 50s, so that's pretty darn young, especially when I'm north of 60. So, and having that kind of bypass surgery usually indicates long-term lifestyle choices that were not great. And anyway, I was saying, yeah, it's pretty as routine as opening your chest and stopping your heart can be, but it's pretty routine surgery these days, and the outcome should be good. She said, yeah, well, he has some other problems because he also had, he's obese and he has diabetes and he's had cancer. And, in my book, I have a diagram that talks about chronic disease. And the main chronic diseases are just what I said: cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and probably Alzheimer's. You can add that in, there's a neurological condition. And those are kind of the four horsemen, of morbidity and mortality, that the chronic disease. And those are all mostly related to lifestyle choices, which is lack of exercise, poor diet, and too much alcohol, whatever. But to try and figure out what was most important in causing that kind of chronic disease, there's an exhaustive study done, believe it was published in 2017 in the journal The Lancet, that looked at the global cause of these chronic diseases. So chronic disease is opposed to acute things, that happen suddenly, like infections and so on. And they determined that overall, if you looked at all of the lifestyle choices, they looked at smoking, alcohol and drug abuse. They looked at sedentary behavior and lack of exercise, which are related but different things. That nutrition was more important than any of them. In fact, it was more important than all the rest of them combined.
Wow.
So if you think about those diseases that cause the morbidity and mortality, the ones we just mentioned, cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer's, um, are they really different diseases or are they manifestations of the same thing? And I would argue that we're coming to a new understanding. I think Peter Attia calls this medicine 3.0, that these are not, I mean, they're diseases, but just because we call them diseases, right? But they are related and they're related to metabolic health, in poor metabolic health. And that goes right back to the cellular molecular level and really what's happening at the mitochondrial level, which are the energy converters within the cell. And so when you start investigating that, you'll see poor metabolic health. And there is something called syndrome X or metabolic disease, which is, high blood pressure, dyslipidemia, so the lipid panels are not right, obesity, and so on. It's called metabolic disorder. But these are just manifestations of that same metabolic disorder becoming the different chronic diseases that we like to name as cancer and cardiovascular disease. But they're all related to inflammation. They're all inflammatory conditions. They're all related or exacerbated by insulin resistance, and they're all aggravated or exacerbated by obesity. And those three things all make each other worse. I think it's on page 57 or so in BioDiet. I have this little diagram, that triangle. I call it the axis of illness, right? So insulin resistance, inflammation, and obesity. And I've gone all over the world. I've presented conferences all over the place. Said, two things I ask people. I go, is there anything wrong with this model? If there is, tell me. Zero. Like every physician will go, yeah. If we get inflammation down, obesity down, insulin resistance down, we could prevent a whole lot of chronic disease from happening or from getting worse. For starters. And the other thing I always ask them is, what is it about a saturated fat that's so? And nobody's ever been able to tell me what it is about a saturated fat that causes a problem, with the exception of palmitic acid. But it's not the palmitic acid in your diet, it's what you produce due to poor metabolic health that causes those problems. So getting back to the root cause of all this, if we look at diet and poor diet being a causative factor in all of these chronic diseases, then does changing diet improve that? And in terms of a scientific study, there isn't enough money on the planet to do a blind controlled study because everybody's got to eat, and you'd have to follow thousands of people for tens or 20, 30 years, tens of years, and then look at the rates of how, and there's just, it's so expensive. I mean, our studies at the Ohio State University with about 20 people in the experimental side, it's like $1 million to do those studies for 20 people over 12 weeks. But what you can do, what we try to do at the BC Cancer Agency, and I'm not there anymore, by the way. I was a visiting scientist there, so, so the bio you're reading is a little bit dated. But I should mention my colleague there, Dr. Jerry Crystal, won a very prestigious award called the Rogers Award, which, in Canada is probably second in value only to a Nobel Prize. Like, it's a very significant for his life's work on low carbohydrate diets and cancer. So any of those people out there that are listening or watching that think, oh, keto diets are a fad, I can tell you they're not a fad. There's 20 years of hard science behind them. We do very sophisticated studies, more so than the other nutritional studies you see, which are these sort of retrospective survey, meta-analyses thing. This is real hardcore cellular molecular science.